What did you learn in the course of your research about the origins of COVID?
I learned that we're not going to answer this question absent one of two things happening. Either we find the intermediate host, the animal that was that spread COVID, or there's a whistleblower inside China, or someone close to this who knows that this came out of a lab, comes forward, defects, goes overseas, or we intercept some communication that we shouldn't have had access to. Absent something like that, we're not going to be able to answer this question. This is going to be a battle of competing narratives. I think over time, the side of the ledger that says that this might have come out of a lab has grown more robust, and the side of the ledger that says that this came out of a natural species has not really moved. And if anything, you can argue that side of the ledger has been diminished by a couple of facts. Number one, we've looked for the intermediate host and we haven't found it. And number two, the idea that the market, this initial market, was the source of the initial spread has been firmly debunked. Even the Chinese acknowledge that. And that was a big part of the thesis around the zoonotic origin, the animal origin, because the idea was that the animal was in that market.
Right.
We now know that market wasn't the source of the spread. It was a path along the spread.
Beijing has even acknowledged that.
Beijing has acknowledged it, right.
When you say intermediate host, you mean what happened between the bat and the human? Who came in between?
There's an animal. It's maybe a pangolin. There's some other animal in between, and it could have been. It wasn't necessarily a bat, and it could have been a bat to a human. But we haven't found the virus in nature, and there's been a pretty exhaustive search. The Chinese have mounted an exhaustive search, and I don't think that the fact that they've been looking for it proves that they know it didn't come out of a lab. I think that they would be looking for it even if they knew it came out of a lab. And the reality is, if it came out of a lab, the number of people who actually are aware of that could be a very small subset of people.
When you say came out of a lab, you were saying through a lab accident, not a construct.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone, and the administration has said this in the intelligence report they put out, that they don't believe. They've sort of firmly debunked the idea that this was something that could have deliberately come out of a lab or was deliberately engineered. But the possibility is that you've had labs doing research on novel coronaviruses. You had novel coronaviruses being brought to those labs, particularly the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We know that they were doing that research in what's called BSL-2 labs, lower security labs where tight precautions aren't taken. We also know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a sloppy lab. At the time that it opened, there was an article in the journal Science raising questions about the integrity of that lab, where scientists at the time that it opened in 2017 said, we're worried about the procedures in this lab. We're worried about the training. We're worried about the way it was built. We know that the lab was conducting high-end research with the Chinese military. The French were in that lab and were eventually kicked out. And at the time that they were kicked out, they were aware that the Chinese military had moved into that lab. So there were the circumstances created around that facility, and there were operating procedures around that facility that created a lot of risk. That doesn't mean it came out of the lab, but it certainly makes that a suspect location. And there was another lab, the CDC, the Chinese CDC maintained a lab literally blocks from the wet market that was first implicated in this virus that was also conducting coronavirus research in BSL-2 labs.
So other than the whodunit factor, why does it matter? Why do we need to know who patient zero is? And how will that affect the Biden administration's response?
Yeah, it matters a lot because if we determine that, first of all, if we determine that this came out of a lab, or we even assess that there's a high probability that this came out of a lab, I think it changes how we try to govern research internationally. We're going to need something like the International Atomic Energy Agency for BSL-4 labs. We're going to have to look much more carefully about who's creating BSL-4 labs, the kind of research going on in those labs.
On the global response, you wrote, COVID crushed the global order of public health cooperation. Are you saying WHO is just not up to the task?
Well, it's not just the WHO. I mean, past epidemics crushed the global order of cooperation. We just didn't learn a lesson.
Was there quashing of information by the WHO?
I think the WHO for too long.
Did they cover up for China, is the allegation?
They weren't willing to confront China, right? They put out statements extolling China's behavior and how forthcoming China was. I mean, it's part of the record now. Tedros, it's in his Twitter feed. It's in the Twitter feed of the head of the WHO, giving props to China for how forthcoming they were. Now, was some of that an attempt to try to give them public praise because privately you were giving them a harder sell? I think some of that was going on in the U.S. with some of the tweets and the statements that we were putting out. I don't know that that was happening at the WHO level, because I was talking to some WHO officials at the time and have talked to a number since. And I think the WHO really did believe China was behaving in sort of an appropriate way and was providing cover for them as they were getting criticized by other parts of the world. Clearly, they weren't, and I think that that was knowable at the time. I mean, China didn't share the source strains. The head of the WHO didn't want to push China on sharing the source strains publicly because he said, well, they have no commitment to do it. And he's right. Under the international health regulations, there was no requirement that you had to share the samples. But there were requirements that you had to share samples of novel emerging respiratory pathogens in other settings. So clearly the spirit of the international health regulations was that this should be shared. But because it wasn't the letter of the law, the WHO didn't want to push China publicly to do it, even though that would have been very helpful for other
You're
nations.
talking about actual viral samples, not the
Samples,
sequencing.
right? Actual samples of the virus, because the sequence alone isn't good enough if you want to develop a vaccine or a diagnostic. You actually, at some point, need the live virus. Now, we eventually got the live virus because we had spread here in the United States, but at least publicly, we didn't have the virus until there was a case in Seattle. It's possible we got the virus earlier from one of China's neighbors where there was some earlier spread.
Is that part of the equation being dealt with now?
No, I don't think the WHO has taken any steps to reform how it operates in a global crisis like this. Whether or not the organization has the self-awareness to do that and is able to self-organize to actually implement meaningful reform, I'm not sure. I think the Biden administration lost an opportunity to compel different behavior out of the WHO by simply rejoining the WHO. I was critical at the time that the President Trump made the decision to pull out of the WHO. I had actually spoken with him directly, urging him not to do it, suggested that there were other ways he could send a strong message to China short of pulling out of the WHO. But once we pulled out of the WHO and we were going to re-enter, we should have used the re-entry to extract some kind of agreement about the WHO engaging in some reform process. And as best I know, and as best we all know, based on what's public, that wasn't done.
Leverage was given up.
The leverage was given up. Yeah.